Section 24 of The Toilers of the Sea by Victor Hugo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by John Greenman. Chapter 12. An Exception in the Character of Lethierry. Mais Lethierry had one defect, a great one. He hated a priest, not as an individual, but as an institution. One day, as he was reading, for he sometimes read, Voltaire, for he now and then read Voltaire, these words, "Priests are cats." He laid down the book, and was heard to mutter in a low tone, "I feel that I am a dog." It must be remembered that the priests, Lutherans and Calvinists, as well as Catholics, had vigorously combated and persecuted him in the creation of his local devil boat. To be a revolutionist in navigation, to try to adopt a spirit of progress to the Norman archipelago, to make the poor little island of Guernsey undergo the first trial of a new invention, was damnable temerity, and we have not concealed the fact. Hence they had condemned him loudly. Let it not be forgotten that we are speaking here of the ancient clergy, very different men from the present clergy, who, in almost all the local churches, have a liberal tendency toward progress. They had interfered with Lethierry. The total amount of obstacle which could be contained in sermons and preachings had been opposed to him. Detested by the churchmen, he detested them. Their hatred of him was the extenuating circumstance of his towards them. But, let us state, his aversion for priests was a peculiarity of his nature. There was no necessity for his hating them or being hated by them. As he had said, he was the dog among these cats. He was against them in idea, and what is more unconquerable, by instinct. He felt their secret claws, and he showed his teeth, somewhat at haphazard, we must admit, and not always appropriately. Not to make distinctions is a mistake. There is no good hatred in the mass. The Savoy and vicar would have found no mercy in his sight. It is not certain that such a thing as a good priest was possible in Mess Lethierry's eyes. By virtue of being a philosopher, he lacked somewhat in wisdom. The intolerance of the tolerant exists, as well as the rage of the moderates. But Lethierry was so kindly by nature that he could not be really a good hater. He repulsed rather than attacked. He kept the churchmen at a distance. They had done him harm. He confined himself to not wishing them well. The shade of difference between their hatred and his lay in the fact that theirs was animosity and his was antipathy. Guernsey, small as is the island, has room for two religions. It contains the Catholic religion and the Protestant religion. Let us add that it does not place the two religions in the same church. Each form of worship has its own temple or chapel. In Germany, at Heidelberg, for instance, they do not stand so much on ceremony. They cut the church in two, one half for St. Peter, the other half for Calvin. Between the two a partition to prevent fisticuffs. Equal shares to each. The Catholics have 3 altars, the Huguenots have 3 altars. As the hours for service are the same, the single bell rings for both at once. It summons at the same time to God and the devil, a very simple arrangement. The phlegmatic German accommodates himself to these customs. But at Guernsey each religion has a home of its own. There is the Orthodox parish and there is the heretic parish. One may choose between them. Neither the one nor the other, such had been the choice of Mess Lethierry. This sailor, this workman, this philosopher, this upstart of labor, while very simple in appearance, was by no means simple at bottom. He had his contradictions and his obstinacies. As to the priest, he was not to be shaken. He could have given points to Montlosier. He permitted himself to indulge in very disrespectful railleries. He said things peculiar to himself, eccentric, but sensible. Going to confession he called combing one's conscience. The small knowledge of letters which he possessed, a certain amount of reading picked up at sea between squalls, was impaired by faults of spelling. He had also faults of pronunciation, but they were always naive. When peace was made by Waterloo between the France of Louis XVIII and the England of Wellington, Mess Lethierry said, "Bourmont has been the traitor of union between the two camps." Note traître d'union instead of trait d'union, point of union, hyphen. Once he wrote papoter, pap ote. Note papacy, pope taken away. We do not think that this was done intentionally. His antipathy did not conciliate the Anglicans in his behalf. He was no more beloved by the Protestant rectors than by the Catholic curés. In the presence of the gravest dogmas his irreligion burst forth almost without restraint. Chance having led him to hear a sermon on hell by the Reverend Jacquemin Hérode, a magnificent sermon filled from one end to the other with sacred texts proving eternal pains, punishment, torments, damnations, inexorable chastisements, endless burnings, inextinguishable curses, the wrath of the omnipotent, celestial furies, divine vengeances, incontestable facts, he was heard to say gently, as he was coming out with one of the faithful, "You see, I have such a queer idea. I imagine that God is good." This leaven of atheism came from his residence in France. Although a Guernsey man, and of tolerably pure race, he was called "the Frenchman" in the island because of his improper mind. He made no secret of the fact that he was impregnated with subversive ideas. His persistence in constructing that steamer, that devil boat, had proved it. He said, "I was suckled by '89." That is not a good sort of milk. Moreover, he was guilty of inconsistencies. It is very difficult to remain by one's self in small countries. In France, to keep up appearances, and in England to be respectable, a peaceable life is to be had only at this price. Being respectable implies a multitude of observances, from Sunday well sanctified to a cravat properly tied. Don't get yourself pointed at. That is the terrible law. To be pointed at is the diminutive of the anathema. Little towns, hotbeds of gossips, excel in this isolating malignity, which is a curse viewed through the small end of the telescope. The most valiant fear this ordeal. A man faces grapeshot, he faces the hurricane, but beats a retreat before Madame Pambèche. Mess Lethierry was more tenacious than logical, but beneath this pressure even his obstinacy gave way. He "put water in his wine," another phrase full of latent concessions and sometimes of such as cannot be acknowledged. He held aloof from members of the clergy, but he did not close his door resolutely against them. On official occasions, and at the stated times for pastoral visits, he received in a proper manner the Lutheran rector or the Papist chaplain, whichever it might be. At distant intervals he accompanied Déruchette to the Anglican parish church, while the latter, as we have said, only went herself on the 4 great festivals of the year. In short, these compromises, which cost him an effort, irritated him, and, far from inclining him towards churchmen, increased his inward resistance. He indemnified himself by more raillery. This man, being devoid of bitterness, had no acidity in his nature except in that direction. There was, however, no way of amending him. In fact and absolutely, such was his temperament, and people had to accept it. All the clergy were distasteful to him. He possessed the irreverence of the Revolution. He made little distinction in the form of worship. He did not even do justice to this great progress of ideas, the cessation of belief in the Real Presence. His short-sightedness in these matters went so far that he could not see any difference between a minister and an abbé. He confounded a reverend doctor with a reverend father. He said, "Wesley is no better than Loyola." When he saw a pastor go by with his wife he turned aside. "Married priest," he said, with the absurd accent which those two words had in France at that time. He was wont to relate that, on his last trip to London, he had seen "the Bishopess of London." His disgust at this sort of union went as far as anger. "Gown and gown cannot wed," he cried. The priesthood, in his eyes, was equivalent to a distinct sex. He would naturally have said, "Neither man nor woman, only a priest." He applied, with bad taste, to the Anglican clergy and to the Papal clergy the same disdainful epithets. He included the two cassocks in the same phraseology. He did not trouble himself to vary the soldiers' metonymies in use at that period for any priest, no matter what they were, Catholic or Lutheran. He said to Déruchette, "Marry whom you will, provided it is not a priest." Chapter 12. An exception in the character of Lethierry.